Okay, so this parsha is the second in Devarim, and remember what we said last week, which is a very important introduction, that Moshe is speaking for the whole book of Devarim, his words, and his purpose is to teach and inspire the current generation of people who are the children of the initial generation that came out of Egypt. They're the ones, the initial generation is going to die out, and probably 99% of them have already died out. And because in the month they're going to cross over the Jordan. So that's the entry of the children of that previous generation. And so the whole parsha of the whole book of Devarim is the collection of Moshe's sermons to this new generation right before they cross over and enter. And this parsha starts with that very uncomfortable request. Moshe appeals to God one last time and asks him, please let me cross over. And God says, no, and don't ask anymore, because our plan is that Yehoshua is going to take the people over and not you. And when we discuss the sin of Moshe and why it is he was not allowed to go in, then we can understand why God is, it's not about forgiving a sin. It's because Moshe can't be the one to bring the people over. And we discuss why that was the case when we were in the Parsha of Hukat. Okay, so
Question for you. How
what?
come the generation we're talking about is not 20 years, but 40 years? Because right now, if you talk about previous generations, it's only 20 years.
What do you mean?
No, it's 40 years from the generation that came out of Egypt. Remember, they were in the desert for 40 years, and now they're going to cross over. But meanwhile, the new generation had to be under 20. So in other words, they had to be at most a teenager. But during this 40 years, there were new children born. There were all families had more children, and those children are the ones that are going to go in. Anybody that came out of Egypt has already died, because that was what God said. Because of the spy incident, all those who came out of Egypt who didn't want to go straight to Eretz Yisrael are going to die out, and only their children are going to come in. Okay? So there were some that were alive at the time because they were younger, they were teenagers, they were younger than 20.
Right.
But most of the people, 80% of the new generation, was born during this 40 years. Okay, so now in this Parsha Va'Etchanan, we have a number of things, and I have to pick one of them. And what I picked was the Shema paragraph, because from the time of the Talmud, discussion in the Talmud, and was codified in the codes of law, that this first sentence, the Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, is of such significance that it is considered the definition of prayer. In other words, when a person recites this verse morning and night, then they have fulfilled their obligation, their biblical, not their rabbinic, but the biblical obligation of prayer is fulfilled by this first pasuk. But you have to have the intent to do that, and that's why we have this custom to put your hand over your eyes, because that reminds you to focus and have the intent of this first sentence. The problem is, what are we supposed to concentrate on? In other words, what is this first sentence supposed to mean that is so significant? And that's what we're going to talk about in the first part. And then we'll talk about the paragraph, the ahafta, that first paragraph, and some of the discussion about what that's supposed to mean. Okay, so that's going to be our focus, the first line, and then the following paragraph of V'ahavta es Hashem Elokecha. Okay, so it starts out Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, and what our big question is that we're going to try to focus on is what does it mean, and especially it's the last word. We understand Shema Yisrael, we understand Hashem Elokeinu, we understand God's name, but what is Echad? What's the statement that we're making when we use that last word Echad? So that's going to be the first half of our discussion. Okay, and then we're going to go into the next psukim, V'ahavta es Hashem Elokecha, to love God. And the question is, what does that mean? To love God, is that legislating an emotion that we have to somehow evoke an emotion of love? And what does that mean? B'chol levavecha, b'chol nafshecha, b'chol modecha is an expression which includes our whole being. In other words, first of all, lavav in biblical Hebrew doesn't mean emotion. A lave is the seat of the mind in biblical terminology. Every time it says lave, it means intellect. They didn't describe it to the brain. Well, they didn't. It's the combination of intellect and emotion. Sometimes it's specifically emotion, sometimes it's specifically mind, but in this sentence, it's a way of saying with all our being, with all of our soul, with all of our mind, with all of our emotion, and with all of our attributes. Ma'od is it could be a possession. It could be something physical. In other words, with everything that we have, or it could be with everything that we are. But clearly, it's a phrase that focuses on the idea with the idea of completely. We should love God completely. And then v'hayu advrim ha'ele asher anochi metzavecha hayom al levavecha, and the words, these words that I'm commanding you, and that's going to be another question. What words? What is it referring to? Al levavecha, and here you see that the word lev is used not in emotion, it's used on intellect, because when it says these words should be in your mind, it's using levav as your mind rather than your emotion. V'shinantem levanecha, and you should teach them or impress them onto your children. And we'll talk about that word. What does that word shinantem mean? It doesn't say lilamed, the normal word for teach. It uses a different word. V'shinantem levanecha, v'dibarta bam, and speak about these divarim, whatever the divarim are. B'shivtecha b'veitecha, when you are in your home. B'lechtecha b'derech, when you travel, when you're walking outside your home. B'shachbecha, when you lie down in the evening at night. Remember, people didn't have electric lights, and they basically, because they're up at the crack of dawn, they're an agrarian society. You have work in the fields that starts at daybreak. So when it becomes dark, people go to sleep early, and much earlier than we do. They would go to sleep when the sun goes down. They probably eat their meal and then they sleep. Uvekumecha, and when you rise up early in the morning. So you should speak and teach your children all the time. When you're in the house, when you're walking to your fields, when you lie down, when you rise up. And you should bind them as a sign or a symbol on your hand. V'hayu letotafot beinenecha, and they should be for some type of an ornament, a diadem, something that you wear on your forehead. Beinenecha, meaning that the major ornament should be in the middle of your forehead, between your eyes. And you should write again these words on the doorposts of your house and on the doorposts of your gates. When you have a gate that surrounds your house, that these words should be on both places. Okay, and doesn't in the ancient those even though doorposts were mostly wood, so we don't have any doorposts left from ancient times, but it became the custom of many societies to actually inscribe words into the wooden doorpost, and then eventually, since that was a very difficult task, it was changed to writing them on parchment and then attaching them to the doorposts of a house and gate. Okay, so that's our paragraph that we're going to study in more depth. Okay, so here is our first issue, is trying to understand what is this first sentence supposed to teach us that we have to concentrate on. And so the focus again is the word echad. What is echad that we're talking about? God is echad. What does that mean? So the Rambam famously, in his discussion of the mitzvah of saying the Shema verse, sees this verse as a philosophical proof that God is not corporeal. That is, that you can't, unlike picturing God like the pagans picture their idols as something physical, God is not physical. This is his quote, since he, meaning God, is not corporeal, has no physical characteristics, the corporeal events such that he be divided or separated from another do not apply to him. Hence, it is impossible for him to be other than one. In other words, what the Rambam is saying is that this verse is teaching us a philosophical, abstract concept that the essence of God is a unity, is just one. There is no way to divide or separate or even describe God. So famously, the Rambam says is that we can't use adjectives when we talk about God. If you talk about God, for example, as kind, then it means he's kind, but not something else. And that would be impossible because God has to be everything. So you can't even use words to describe God, the essence of God. God is just one unified whole. And that's
Dave,
what his pasuk is to teach. Yeah.
doesn't it also just highlight the concept of monotheism versus the idol worships who have many different idols that they worship, many different gods?
According to Rambam, we'll see, others will say that. But according to Rambam, this is not about distinguishing a difference between God and idols. Okay, other people are going to interpret it that way. He sees it as it's not about comparing it to anything, that God is a unique everything. God is an everything, and therefore there's no such thing as either describing God or comparing God. Okay? It's a philosophical, abstract concept. God is everything, and therefore nothing else exists. There isn't anything. Certainly there's no other gods, but there's nothing else but God. Okay, so remember the Rambam is talking as a philosopher in this, in his definition. Sefer HaChinuch is another book that was written, we don't exactly know who wrote it, during the early Middle Ages, which takes all the commandments and tries to explain them. like the Rambam does as well, and like the Ramban does as well. Each one has a book of trying to explain all the commandments. And so the Sefer HaChinuch explains this commandment of the Shema Yisrael statement as referring to God's oneness, which we are enjoined to believe that Hashem is the initiator and cause of all existence, Lord of all, singularity, and without any others. So here is where, Tzipora, there's the idea of comparisons, that according to this point of view, what that statement should evoke in our consciousness is that God is the creator of the universe. He initiated everything that's here, and he's the cause of everything in existence, and he's the Lord of all. He is the Ribono Shel Olam. He is the master of the universe. He's the creator of the universe, and he's the master of the universe. He alone. It's a singularity. There's no other creator, and there's no other master, and it's only God. So that's what he says you have in mind when you say this first verse. That's what it's referring to. Okay, another point of view. The Rashbam. Now, the Rashbam is, I think when we mentioned him many times, he is what's called a Pashtan. He's kind of like Hirsch, where he takes the text very seriously and looks at what the text is saying and tries to figure out what the word means in context, which is what Pashtanim do. So the Rashbam has a different interpretation. He says, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem not is one, but alone. Hashem alone, only Hashem. And he interprets the word echad as alone. And David Zvi Hoffman, who is much more contemporary, 19th century, supports the Rashbam's translation by saying there's a pasuk in Divrei Hayamim that says King David said to the entire assembly, God has chosen my son Solomon echad. God has chosen my son Shlomo echad. He used the word echad, an inexperienced lad. So the use of the word echad here means, in the context of this pasuk, and the use of the word means alone. It's as if David says, God has chosen my son Solomon alone, an inexperienced lad. There's no other leader. There's no other person who's going to take over for me other than Shlomo. None of the other brothers, none of the other sons, nobody else, alone. So the word echad, says the Rashbam, and supported by the Netziv, means echad, meaning alone, only God and no other. Okay, so now we're going to look at some problems with these translations, these proposals. What's the problems? So first of all, the idea of God, God's essence, as the Rambam says, is a philosophical notion for the Middle Ages. Remember what Hirsch's point of view, and he's repeated this over and over and over again, is that the Torah is speaking to the people of the times. Now, it not only speaks to the people of the times, in other words, it represents ideas and values and principles, so those are eternal. But the language, when Moshe is speaking in his sermons to the new generation, he's speaking to them. And the idea of the Rambam is a philosophical idea that doesn't come about in thinking. Certainly this generation of the desert are not philosophers. There's no education. There's no sophistication. So you can't use the Rambam. You can't say the Rambam is saying that Moshe is teaching the people a philosophical notion of the essence of God being an indescribable entity. It's just too sophisticated for us to say. Now, for later generations, you could think that way if you want, but that can't be what the pasuk is talking about. So that's problematic. As the Chinuch says, you proclaim God as the singular creator and Ribono Shel Olam, master of the universe. And here, there's a better word. If you mean only singular, you would say Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Yachid. Yachid means unique or singular. There is only one creator. There is only one master of the universe. So it shouldn't say the word Echad. It should say the word Yachid, which is a better description of what the Chinuch is proposing. And then in terms of the Rashbam, who says the word means alone, in fact, there is another pasuk that says exactly that. If you daven at a Sephardi congregation, when they take out the Torah, they don't say what we Ashkenazim say, Vayi ben Zoharon. They say, Ata hareta ladat, ki Hashem hu Elokim, ein od milvado. That's what they say. And that's a pasuk in the 4th chapter. It's in the same center of Va'Etchanan and appears later in the 4th chapter. But the word that's used is milvado. There is no other. Milvado. So if the Rashbam rather, is right in saying that echad means alone, we have a biblical word for alone that's used within the next couple chapters, livado. And therefore you would have to say Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem livado, not echad. So for all these reasons, it doesn't answer. There's nobody that has a strong explanation for what we're supposed to understand the word echad to refer to.
Steve,
Yeah.
I'm just struggling with this. I think I have a lot here to just try to figure out to digest, because to me it does speak to the people, specifically because, like I said, they're coming from a place of idol worship,
Right.
and worshiping many idols. And so that to me, they've,
No, you're right.
the-
You're right. You're right. But what the challenge to a Pashtan who is reading the text is to say it's important for us to understand why Moshe chose the word echad. Why not choose a word that he uses later on, livado, if he meant alone and there's no others? Why didn't he use a word yachid, which means unique? It means but there's no others like him. All of these would say the same thing. All of those would say, and Moshe says it in many different places, to reject the idea of idols. It says in the Aseret Dibra, right? The Aseret Dibra, what's the second one? Lo yeh lecha Elohim acherim al panai.
right.
So in the Aseret Dibra, it makes the explicit statement that in God's presence there's no other Elohim acherim. There are no other gods. So yes, that is a principle, a very important principle, but it's not using the same language in this pasuk. And that's what the challenge is, to find out what this word echad means different from all the other synonyms that are used, that Moshe himself uses, and that God uses in the Aseret HaDibrot. Okay?
Yeah.
So it's not saying that something wrong with the idea. It's not. The idea is a similar idea, but we're trying to understand what's being conveyed by this particular word. Okay, so now Hirsch starts, before he's going to propose his explanation of echad. He wants us to pay attention to the first word. The first word is also interesting because Moshe uses two words many times in his sermons. One is Shema Yisrael, and he uses that, I think, 4 times, even in this Parsha, to introduce what he's saying. So he says Shema Yisrael. This is not the unique expression in our pasuk. It appears many times. But he also uses very often Re'eh, U, or see. Sometimes it's hear, Yisrael, and sometimes Re'eh, see. So why in this particular case, in this paragraph, does he use the word Shema rather than Re'u, to see? And he gives the quote when Moshe is reiterating in the Parsha, when he's reiterating the experience of Har Sinai. He says, when you heard the voice out of the darkness while the mountain was ablaze with fire, all the leading men of your tribes and your elders came to me, and you said, Hashem, our God, has shown us his glory and his majesty, and we have heard his voice from the fire. And Moshe is going to continue on. He's going to say, and you asked me, and you said you were so frightened, you asked me to be the intermediary for God to talk to me, and not so. But that's not our point here. The point is, he's using the word hear and see in the describing the experience of Har Sinai. And by the way, do you notice I have God in all caps, and I also have God with a capital G and a small od? That's purposeful. When you see God in caps, it refers to God's name, Yud Ke Vav Ke, the tetragrammaton, the 4-letter name of God. When you see it as capital G and small od, it's Elohim or Eloheinu, which is used in many different ways. Okay, so here, as in this quote, it's as you said, God, Hashem, our God, Elokeinu, has shown us his glory. So you have seen. He uses the word to see, has shown you his glory. In other words, the people actually saw God's presence in a cloud on the top of Har Sinai, and you also have heard his voice. You heard the Anochi Hashem Elokecha. Okay, so you saw and you heard. Now, this visual auditory revelation was perceived only by the generation of the wilderness. In other words, only the people who were there at the time. It was the people who came out of Egypt and the young children who were, there under 40 that are still around. Okay, so the main audience that experienced the visual auditory revelation at Har Sinai is the old generation that's essentially died out. The voice heard was God's teaching. In other words, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, and how many Dibrot they heard before they said they can't take it anymore. Some people say it was all 10, some people say it was the first 3, whatever it was. The voice that they heard was what God was teaching to them and what he is going to teach in the future, but through Moshe. Okay, so it was a double revelation, a seeing and a hearing revelation. So Hirsch says, to transmit such an experience, the older generation had to rely on relating these eyewitness facts to their young children, who, on becoming adults, relayed their parents' testimony to their children, and so on through all generations. In other words, the older generation had to tell the ones who now were not there, who were born during these 40 years, which is the bulk of the people now who are going into Eretz Israel, they had to relate what they saw as eyewitnesses to seeing and hearing. They had to relate to this new generation by testimony. In other words, they had to tell them the story because there's no videos, there's no tapes. there's no film. In other words, nobody can see what happened. You can only hear the story from the people who did see it. So the children can only hear it from their parents. Thus,
That's what we do all the time. Isn't that what we do now?
yes, yes, yes.
Yeah.
So listen. So after the first generation of eyewitnesses, the knowledge of God could only be transmitted by words and could only be preserved and passed on by those who heard what their parents are transmitting to them. The Shema then represents an unbroken chain of eyewitness testimony transmitted by the spoken word to the receptive ear. In other words, after this first generation, you have to rely on passing it to the future generations by the story and by the people listening to what you are, the story that you are transmitting. So the next generation would say, well, we weren't there, but our parents told us this and this. And the next generation would have to say, well, we weren't there, but our grandparents told our parents so and so. And then the great grandchildren would have to say, oh, and then this is what our great great grandparents told to our great grandparents who told to our parents. So that's the way it goes. And in fact, this stress that this first line is based on transmitting from one generation to the other is preserved by the scribes in the Sefer Torah. In a Sefer Torah, if you look into today, if you look into a Sefer Torah today, to that first line, Shema Yisrael, you'll see that the ayin and the dalid are intentionally written in large print. The Shema, the ayin of Shema, and the dalid of Echad are put in big print in every Sefer Torah. Okay, why is that? Why do they want to do that? Because ayin and dalid spell the word aid, witness. And so it's telling us that this verse is reminding us that we are witnesses to what it is that we have heard from past generations, and we are responsible, therefore, to pass it to the next generation. And that gives us the clue as to what this next paragraph is all about. But take a look again, as Hirsch always says, look at the context. When you're looking, we're trying to analyze a verse, we're trying to analyze to understand the sentence, look at the context within which this is found. So let's look at the context. In other words, what precedes this Shema Yisrael and the first paragraph, and what follows the Shema Yisrael and this first paragraph. We'll see that in a second. Okay. Actually, let's skip this for now. I'll come back to it. Wait, this is not what I want. Okay, the way I had set up now is that I'm going to analyze the echad first and then go back to the context. So let's just follow the way I set it up, so I don't have to reorganize it. So Hirsch's approach to understanding the verse, how is he going to understand the Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad? He says the clue to how to understand the Echad is the second repetition of the name of God, Hashem Echad. In other words, it doesn't have to read that way. It could read Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Echad. You don't need that second Hashem in it in order to convey the sense of the sentence. Therefore, that extra Hashem is a clue to how to understand this whole verse. So Rav Hirsch looks at the use of the different names of God as a clue to understanding this verse. In other words, there are two names of God in this verse: Hashem, which is repeated twice, and Elokeinu, which is in the center of the verse, in between the two names of Hashem. Now, we have talked about this in previous Parshiot because Hirsch has taught us this from way in the beginning, from Breshit, that the name of Hashem means one thing. In other words, it conveys one set of attributes of God, and the name Elokeinu represents a second set of attributes of God. That's why they're two different names. Now, which one is used in creation? In the first Breshit of creation. If you remember, Elohim is the only name that's used in the entire creation, 7 days of creation. It's only in the next chapter, when the human being is born, that Hashem's name comes in. Okay, so Elokeinu is a name which represents attributes of God as the creator of the universe, the creator of nature. So Elohim is God as creator. He's God as manager of the world. It's the principle of din, of absolute justice. Where do we get that from? Think of nature, right? When God created nature, it makes it very clear that God created all biology and all of the cosmos, all the planets, the sun, the moon, stars, created all of physical, the sea and the dry land. All of that is nature. And all of them, certainly all of them have physics and chemistry laws that we are now, in the last 100 years, um, describing in empirical physics and empirical chemistry to understand nature in its essence. And so we understand the idea of atoms and molecules and neurons, right? All of this we're discovering, but God created nature with all of that. In other words, God created nature that works in ways that we're just discovering in physics and chemistry and biology. And biology is, we know already that all biology have DNAs. And DNAs are what makes species species and what makes flowers flowers and trees trees. Everything has DNA. Okay, and it's God who is the creator of the DNAs and of the physics and chemistry of the universe. What that means is none of those things, biology, chemistry, and physics, have no choice other than to follow their DNA, if they're biology, or to follow their physics or their chemistry, if they are material stuff, non-biological material. In other words, nature has to do what nature does because it was created that way. And that's why the principle of God expressing himself as din, absolute justice. In other words, biology cannot change its own DNA. Physics cannot change its own laws of physics. Chemistry can't change its own laws of chemistry. It's absolute. And it has no ability to change anything different from the way God created it. So when Elohim is used, it means God as the principle of the one who made it the way it's supposed to be. Okay, but where does Hashem come in, the four-letter name? When God creates humankind, and there is different from the rest of nature, because humans have, as we learned, free choice, other than anything in nature. Chemistry doesn't have free choice. Biology doesn't have free choice. Physics don't have free choice. Only human beings. And if God creates a human being that has free choice, it means it can be different from the way God intended it to be. And that's the whole story. The whole first stories of Bereshit is how human beings corrupted their purpose of being. And so God then has to appear in a different way, as compassionate, as forgiving, as merciful, as rachamim, benevolent, kind, because if God wasn't that way, he would destroy us. In other words, we wouldn't live, because we would have violated, the moment we violated our DNA, we would be considered corrupting our nature, and we would cease to exist. Just like when a biological DNA is corrupted, the biological thing, whether it's a flower, whether it's an insect, whether it's an animal, if the DNA becomes corrupted, it dies. The thing dies because it can't exist with the corrupted DNA. We can, but if we can exist in a corrupted state, we have to have God who's going to forgive us and be benevolent and going to be kind and allow us to continue to exist, even if we don't do what we're supposed to do, unlike nature. So when we see the word Elohim, when we say Elokeinu, our God, it means God as the creator of nature who expects us to fulfill our purpose of being created. But when you use the word Hashem, it means God has superimposed himself with characteristics of forgiving and mercy and benevolence and kindness for us, even though we corrupt our nature. Okay, so you see there are two expressions of God. Now, the challenge is, how do you put those in this pasuk and make sense of the pasuk? So given the above order of the verse, the message would be as follows. The statement of the Shema Yisrael statement is, God declares that he shows himself to us in two apparently contrasting ways. At times, he bestows blessing and well-being, and by forgiveness and kindness and so forth. That's Yud Ke Vav Ke. That's the Hashem expression. At other times, he brings us painful experiences as natural consequences, as he would treat nature. In other words, if we corrupt ourselves, then there is consequences to that. There are punishments. There are suffering. We suffer the consequence of our distorted being that we choose. So that's where Elohim is showing himself as Elohim, as relating to us as he would relate to the rest of nature, which is very exact, not benevolent, not forgiving, but it has to be the way it's supposed to be. So God can be both. Sometimes he's Hashem, sometimes he is God the disciplinarian. So the verse proclaims the idea that either attribute is actually a manifestation of the benevolent God, of the Hashem. In other words, the suffering, hardship, and pain and misfortune we experience in life when God relates to us as Elohim is ultimately for our benefit. That is, to spur us to either self-examination and tshuva, or to challenge us to grow through the experience of suffering. In other words, the Hashem is inherently a benevolent and gracious God. However, sometimes he'll show himself as Elohim, which holds us responsible to our behavior, and he's not gracious and he's not forgiving, and therefore sometimes we have challenging consequences that we deserve. But you see that Hashem appears a second time after Elokeinu. And therefore it says that either God as the benevolent God or the God as the God who is a disciplinarian, in both cases, God is still benevolent, which means the translation then of Echad. Now here's a different translation. What does it mean, Echad? It means the God of benevolence, Yud Kei Vav Kei, although at times manifesting himself as Elohim, as God the disciplinarian, is in actuality the God of benevolence. He is in actuality Yud Kei Vav Kei. That is the overlay of God. God is always one. God is always Yud Kei Vav Kei. Sometimes he may be Elohim, but he is one. He's always a Yud Kei Vav Kei. Echad. Echad means he's always Yud Kei Vav Kei. He's always that God of benevolence, kindness, forgiveness, and the guy that relates to us as human beings. So that's the Echad. When we say Echad, it means although there are different attributes at different times of God, there really is only one God, and that one God is Yud Kei Vav Kei. That is Hashem.
Isn't this just another, for me, my small mind, a perception of a good parent, a good father?
Yeah,
The fact that,
right. In other words, God Yud Kei Vav Kei is God the Father,
yeah,
and
absolutely.
God and Elohim is God the King or the Judge.
Yeah, but isn't that what a good father does? I mean,
Right. It's
pushing you in
both.
the right direction.
However, this pasuk is saying, although God can be the judge of the world, who holds us responsible, and
Mhm.
God can be the one who is the shofet and the director of the world, okay, and does things that we don't feel it's personally beneficial. But that God is actually and never changes. He is always Yud Kei
That's
Vav
what a
Kei.
child feels like to that's what a child feels like, a younger child to a good father.
Exactly, exactly. When you have a child's relationship to a parent, the parent is inherently a loving parent,
Yeah,
right? Is inherently a loving parent. Now, sometimes that loving parent has to be a disciplinarian, and sometimes that loving parent's got to punish the kids. But,
absolutely.
but it's the same parent. Ultimately, it's the benevolent parent.
Yeah.
That's the point. That's the point. Okay, so that's a good example to prove what he's trying to say in less abstract philosophical way. In other words, God is really ultimately in the role of our parent who loves his children. Sometimes he's going to be the disciplinarian, but even when he's the disciplinarian, he is the father who loves his children. Okay, so now let's take the paragraph and then we'll go back to our other question about the context. V'ahavta es Hashem Elokecha b'chol levavecha v'chol nafshecha. What is v'ahavta? So the Rambam, Maimonides, is again trying to define for us what this means. And he says love is what it means when it says v'ahavta. It's talking about a intellectual or cognitive attachment to God. That's what it's asking. Not in this case, it's a intellectual attachment. How does that come about? He says the moment a person reflects on God's deeds and creation. So you think about God as the creator of the universe, how wondrous and great the universe is. He cannot help but love God by being seized by a desire to know his great name. In other words, when we see nature, or we see the nature of a human being or the biology of the human being, how human beings work, or how nature is the beauty of nature, we have a desire to know the Creator. We have a desire to know God. And therefore, that desire comes about through understanding, through learning, through exposure to understanding God's world. In the Sefer HaMitzvot, he writes, we are to contemplate his commandments so that we may come closer to understanding him, thereby attain absolute joy. This comprises the love of him with which we are commanded of V'ahavta es Hashem Elokecha, and we have also explained that this includes obligation. In other words, when you love God, you're also obligated towards God. But in other words, what he's trying to say is, this applies to not only looking at nature and how God is the creator, but how God is the one who teaches us mitzvot. And the more we study mitzvot, which is what Hirsch says, the more we study the meaning of mitzvot and trying to understand why we're doing what we're doing and what these mitzvot mean to us, give meaning in our lives, then we attain a joy of understanding God. And that's what V'ahavta requires us to do. But then the Rambam says that there's also an emotional attachment. And here he describes it this way. He says, what is correct love besides the intellectual? He says, one is to possess an exceedingly powerful love so that his very soul, b'chol lavavecha v'chol nafshecha, is bound by the love of God, being enraptured by it, as a lovesick person continually languishes after his beloved with whom he is preoccupied, whether he's in his house, whether he's walking, whether he's going to sleep, whether he's rising up, whether he's eating, drinking. In other words, he is infatuated by God to the point where it's like a lovesick person. They think about them all the time. They can't help. They can't help it. So the Rambam says, so there are two elements of V'ahavta es Hashem Elokecha b'chol lavavecha v'chol nafshecha v'chol modecha, meaning you have to have an intellectual appreciation of God, and you have to have an emotional attachment similar to an attachment of a lovesick person to his beloved who he thinks about all the time. Okay, and that's why it says, okay, so that's
Yes, Steve. It's also, I'm just thinking about how it's a contrast to the Shema, the
right.
focus on the listening, because this requires really opening up your eyes, looking around, looking at nature.
Yes.
That's and
Yeah.
then obviously being grateful.
Correct. And we're going to see for a minute what is the Shema, why is the focus on the listening part. We'll sing that in a minute. But this first paragraph, from the Rambam's point of view, this first paragraph covers the entire essence of a person. That's why it says, meaning one's intellect and appreciation and gratitude because we understand God intellectually, and the emotional attachment we have for God because we are appreciative and because we are such in awe. That's what awe is. When you're in awe of God, you have an attachment to a person who you are in awe of, and that's the emotional element of this first paragraph. Now we're going to go back to this in this first paragraph where it says, "V'hayu hadavarim ha'ele asher anochi mitzavecha hayom al levavecha." Now we don't know what is hadavarim ha'ele. What are the things that I give you today that's supposed to be on your heart and that you're supposed to impress on your children and talk about them when you sit at home and when you travel and when you lie down, when you notice what is it, v'hayu hadivorim ha'ela. And here is where we go into the context. What is it that we're supposed to bind as a sign on our hands and our foreheads and write on the doorpost as a reminder of these devarim? In other words, these devarim have a number of different commandments associated to them. One is to impress them on your children all the time. Another is to impress them on yourself by binding themselves on your hands or arms and your forehead, and to bind them within your house by writing them on the doorpost of your house. So when you go into your house, you'll be reminded of these things. Okay, we still don't know what it is that is the Hadivorim Ha'ela. So here's where we have to look at the context. Look at the brackets. Here is what precedes the paragraph. Ele ha-mitzvot, ha-chukim, va-ha-mishpatim, that Hashem, your God, has directed me to teach you to observe in the land that you are crossing, so that you, your children, and their children after them may fear God, meaning be in awe of God, as long as you live, by keeping all of his mitzvot, his chukim and his mishpatim that I give you, so that you may enjoy long life on the land. Shema Yisrael, here's where he uses Shema. Again, this is before the Shema Yisrael sentence. He's using Shema Yisrael. Hear, Israel, and be careful to obey, so that it may go well with you, and you may increase greatly in the land flowing with milk and honey. Okay? So in other words, what's the focus of this paragraph? This paragraph is Moshe is teaching all the chukim and the mishpatim, all the commandments, all of the laws. And why is he teaching it to you now? So that you teach your children and the children after them, so that they may be in awe of God and keep all the chukim and mishpatim that I give you. In other words, the focus is on transmitting this to your children. And that's why he says, hear, O Israel, again. It's hear. Hear meaning listen to what listen to what you heard and that you need to pass on to your children. Now this is the paragraph before the Shema paragraph. Now let's look at the paragraph after the Shema paragraph. In the future, when your child asks you, Ki yishala bincha, when your child asks you, what is the meaning of all of these chukim and mishpatim that I've commanded you and so forth, so you should tell him the story that starts with being slaves in Egypt, and then you'll say, God commanded us to obey all of these decrees and to be in awe of God so that we might always prosper. So here, in the following paragraph to the Shema paragraph, the theme again is teaching your children. So if before and after the theme is the same, the brackets is about teaching your children, now we can go back to the commandment of that paragraph. Vishinantam levanecha is referring to all the chukim and mishpatim that God is teaching, and you are to pass that on and teach it to next generation. So the Rambam uses this paragraph, the V'ahavta paragraph, as the source of the command to learn and teach Torah. This is called Talmud Torah. And when it says, Vishinantam levanecha, to impress them upon your children, it is impress them upon your children refers not only to your children, but to anybody that you teach, to your disciples. In other words, anybody that you teach are in the category of your children. In other words, you're passing it on to the next generation by teaching somebody else. When you have your kids and your grandkids at your Shabbos table and you teach a Devar Torah, you are fulfilling this requirement of the paragraph of the Shema to pass on and transmit Torah teaching, whatever the Torah teaching is, whether it's a drasha or whether it's learning or whatever it is, but it's a responsibility for everyone to teach the next generation. It is also said, Vishinantam levanecha. Why is it using the word vishinantam and not lilamed, just the usual word to teach? So the word vishinantem, this is a Hersheian idea. It's vishinantem means that the method of your teaching should be sharp in your mouth. What does that mean? It's a play on the word vishinantem. The root is shane. Shane means a tooth. A tooth is an incisor. An incisor in English would mean incisively, to use that word. So it's telling us how we should teach. We should teach in an incisive manner. Someone asks you something, do not answer with a stammer, but tell that person incisively. In other words, when you're teaching something, teach it with commitment. Teach it with persuasion. That's vishinantam. It's not just teaching words. It's presenting it in a way which impresses, which is an incisive answer to a question or to an idea or to whatever it is that you're asked about. Be passionate and persuasive in your teaching. It's not just saying words. So that's why you use
Steve,
content. And by the
yeah,
way,
yeah,
a less drush way is vishinantam is the same root of the word mishnah, which means to repeat. When you learn,
right.
when you're transmitting oral teachings, they're not in writing, and you're transmitting orally, you repeat over and over again. And so the nuance of the word vishinantam means you don't just do it one time. You repeat these principles to your children at all times. Okay, so in other words, it's the use of the word instead of the plain word v'limadatem, to teach, is vishinantem, meaning to repeat to the same ideas in different ways over and over again, because they're so important. And so it's telling you how to teach in a way which is impressive because you're repeating ideas, which is being persuasive. Yes, what were we going to say?
No, you just got to it. Perfect. So,
Okay, now the Rambam continues and says this commandment of learning in order to teach, someone whose parent has not taught him is obligated to teach himself. In other words, if you didn't have any, when you grew up, you didn't have parents who transmitted all these teachings, or you didn't go to a school where, like yeshiva day school, then you are required to study them and observe them faithfully. In other words, it says not in this pasuk, but in chapter 5, you have to study the chukim and mishpatim and observe them. Thus, everywhere one finds that study precedes action, since learning leads to doing, but doing does not lead to learning. That's a phrase that the Gemara uses, that which is more important, study or doing? And the conclusion is studying is more important because study will inspire you to act. If you're just acting mindlessly, then it doesn't inspire you to learn. You're just doing it because you're supposed to do it. And that's not what this is about. What this is about is you need to do something meaningfully. But if you're doing it meaningfully, it means you have to study what it's about and understand it, then you can act meaningfully. If you're just acting without thinking about what it means, then it doesn't lead to study. So it's more important to study and then learn, to study and then act, than it is to just act conventionally because you do what everybody else does, but you don't bother to try to find the meaningfulness of what you're doing. One can do an action mindlessly, and thus it does not lead to study. And he goes on, just as a person is commanded to teach his children, so too he's commanded to teach himself. Every Jew is obligated to study Torah, says the Rambam, be him rich, whether he's poor, whether he's in good physical condition, or whether he's handicapped, whether he's young, whether he's worn out and old, like most of us are, even if he's poor and he subsists on charity and begging, doesn't matter. Everybody, even if he has a whole big family he has to worry about, he must set aside a time to study Torah day and night. That's what this paragraph is saying. That it means that you have to set aside some learning no matter what your conditions are. Well, it doesn't matter if you're rich, you're poor, you're physically weak, you're economically challenged. Doesn't matter. You always have to learn Torah day and night. Now, what about binding them? This that's a very interesting thing. We'll just do this quickly because it's a fascinating footnote. When it says, bind them as signs upon your hands and ornaments on your forehead, write them on the doorposts of your house. Question is, are these commands for actual objects to be placed on your arm and forehead? Or is it a poetic metaphor? Like the previous verse. We just had a verse, right? V'hayu hadavarim asher anochi mitzavecha hayom al livavecha, al livavecha, on your heart. Does that mean physically you should take a copy of the Chukim and Mishpatim and attach it to your chest? Is that what it means? It should be on your heart? No, clearly we take it metaphorically. Well, if we take that metaphorically, why should we take the next two verses also metaphorically? When it says to bind it on your arm and on your head, why shouldn't that be metaphoric? Okay, it's the Rashbam asked this question because he is the Pashtan. He's saying, look at the words, look at what it says. And he says, look at the other places where it says to put something on your arm and a seal on your heart. It's always metaphorical. Like in Shir Hashirim, when the lover is talking about the beloved, place me like a seal on your heart, like a seal on your arm, for love is as strong as death. Well, that's not meant to put something physical on your heart or on your arm. It's a metaphor for always having it in your mind and always having it in your actions that should express your love. That's what it means. It's a metaphor. Similarly, in Proverbs, when it says, "Keep your father's commands and don't forsake your mother's teachings. Bind them on your heart forever. Fasten them as a necklace around your neck." And it uses the word kashrem al libcha tamid, undame al garganosecha. These are physical descriptions, but nobody says you're supposed to wear necklaces or bind them. The commands of your father or the teachings of your mother. It doesn't say that. It's used in a metaphorical way. When you walk, they will guide you. When you sleep, they will watch over you. When you're awake, they will speak to you. But it's metaphorical. In other words, keep them in mind. So wherever you go, you'll have them in mind. They'll speak to you because you'll see it's as if you had a necklace that's reminding you, like a mezuzah around your neck. Okay. All of these are metaphorical. Listen, my son, to your father's instruction. Don't forsake your mother's teaching. They will be a garland to grace your head and a chain to adorn your neck. All this is metaphorical, for they will prolong your life. Let love and faithfulness never leave you. When it says bind them on your neck and write them on your heart, it means keep it forever. Make sure it's like as if you had it in your body and you're wearing it around your neck. So, but all these are metaphorical language. So why should we take the pasuk ukshatem laota yadecha to be tefillin? Why should we think that they're real little boxes that are on your arm and on your head? Why don't we say it like it's used in Mishlei and when it's used in Shir Hashirim as just metaphors for keeping something in mind and keeping something to guide you as you go through life? So the Rashban says, that's his challenge. He says, maybe this is a metaphor. But then he said, some commentators dispute our holy ancestors, that is Chazal, and the rabbinic tradition, meaning it's our Torah Shebaal Peh that say that when it says it should be an ot al yadecha lezikaron ulertotafot beineinecha, they mean actual tefillin boxes, right? And maybe what he's saying is, if you dispute the the um, the words that ukshartem and a reminder is is metaphorical and not to be taken literally, how come the Chachamim say that you are to bind them on your arm and put them on your head? Why shouldn't it be just like Al Livavecha, which is metaphorical? That's his challenge. His challenge is, where does the Chachamim get the notion that this refers to putting on tefillin? And he says, all this is incorrect. He's saying it about himself. He's saying, my challenge to say this all should be metaphorical is incorrect. Why? Because he says the parables of Shlomo. Shlomo is the one who wrote Shir HaShirim and who wrote Mishlei. And it says all that is mentioned in Mishlei or Shir HaShirim is meant to be metaphor and parable. In other words, it was written to be a metaphor and parable. But the Torah was not written as a parable. The Torah was not written in metaphorical language. It's written as a book of law and as a book of teaching, not as a book of metaphors. So it has to be understood literally. So although we can understand Mishlei and Shir HaShirim metaphorically, we should not make the mistake to say, therefore, we should understand when the Chumash says it, and you should bind them on your hand, and you should have something between your eyes, an ornament. We should not say that they are metaphorical. They are meant literal. It is to be understood literally. And hence, we shall not draw the verse out of its Torah's Peshat, in that its understanding does not contradict logical thinking. In other words, when the Torah wants to use a metaphor, then it means the pshat will never, it doesn't make sense as pshat. Okay, but this can be seen very clearly as not a metaphor, but as an actual do something, because the last sentence it says, that clearly is literal. Everybody agrees that's literal. So the two verses that precede it, is equally literal. Just like you have to write something on the doorpost of your house, you have to bind something on your house. So what he's saying is, if I really pay attention to the words and I'm using the words as telling me that it's, you don't have to do any, you have to put on tefillin, it's all metaphorical, he says, I'm not saying that. That's wrong. Because our Chachamim say, first of all, Mishlei and Shir HaShirim are no proof for the Chumash, because the Chumash doesn't write in metaphors. And number two, it doesn't contradict logical thinking that you could put something, an oat, you can put something symbolic physically on your arm and an ornament on your head. And that's the way they take it, and that's the mitzvah of tefillin. So it has to be, even though it's could be seen as metaphorical, it would be a mistake to see it that way. And one has to put on tefillin just like as one has to write a mezuzah for one's doorpost. Okay, a lot to absorb.
Yes, much. Thank you, but it's really so interesting.
Yeah, it's it's always worth if you really want to go over it, to go over the recording and be able to sort of review some of these very philosophical abstract ideas.
Yeah, it raises more questions. We could actually do this in 2 sessions, right?
It does.
Mhm.
It does. Okay, I'm stopping the recording.